Hello and welcome to another episode of Trash to Track. In this episode we're going to be taking a look at my dad's Mainline Railways Class 45 peak locomotive. Now it's probably been the best part of 2 decades since this has run, and you can see here the box is in pretty bad shape at the back. Now I've been told on good authority that I did that when I was a nipper, so apologies for that. So getting the peak out of its box, it becomes apparent that in the past I've modified this peak and put the buffer beams on the bogies where they should be. And to be honest, if I did that as a teenager, I've not done too bad a job, to be fair. So I'm going to give it a quick battery test on the test track. As I said, it's been about 20 years since this must have ran in anger. And we're going to see what we're working with this model. So getting the battery test here, there's no life in this peak whatsoever. It's not even humming or trying to move. So I think that the battery might not have enough power, as we've had in the past. So I connect some controller leads directly to the track and see where we go from there. But again, nothing. The peak is totally dead. It's not even attempting to move, which is saddening, as I remember this loco running around when I was a kid. So we're going to have a look at this model now and see what the cause of the problem is. First job is to remove the body shell, and to do that with the aid of some cocktail sticks and a flat bladed screwdriver, just loosen the body side clips there, and there's one in each corner under the cab doors, and utilising the cocktail sticks to keep the clips disengaged, the body shell then simply lifts off, revealing the chassis and a lump of polystyrene, which I assume is sound deadening due to the chassis and body shell being quite open. So now that the body shell has been removed, I'm just going to remove that bit of polystyrene there, and I'm going to use the battery and connect it directly to the motor terminals to see if there's a problem with the wiring. Although applying power directly to the terminals, the wheels and the motor are not even attempting to move. So there's something seriously amiss with this motor in this peak, so we're going to have to disassemble the model and investigate further. First off, I'm going to start by removing the front and rear pony trucks on both these bogies, as they're both separate items and they're in the way as they swing independently. So I'm going to remove those. And while I'm at it, I noticed that the old mainline coupling is a screw coupling in the bogie there. So looking in my tub, I find these NEM style couplings that will be a direct replacement. So I'm going to remove the old couplings by removing this small screw, and then we'll replace the couplings later, just so they're up to a more modern standard. Now that we've took them pony trucks off, I'm going to release the motor bogie from the chassis. I'm first going to cut these wires off, as I plan to digitally fit this model if we can get it running, so they're going to have to be cut off anyway. So I'm going to remove these now with a pair of side snips, and then to remove the motor bogie, you have to remove a small plastic clip that is screwed in between the brush holders there. So by removing the screw, the clip comes away, and then the motor bogie simply drops down below the chassis, and now we can service the motor away from the chassis and all that weight that's screwed in there. Now, to remove the motor unit from the bogie frame there, I found it easy to put my tweezer nose pliers in between the wheels and the frame and just unclip it. And now I can get to the underside of the motor and the gear train. It becomes apparent that I can't even turn this motor over with finger pressure. The entire motor is seized solid, so we're going to have to strip this down and see if we can repair it. The drive wheels simply pull out of the motor case in there as they're a clip fit, and then I'm going to undo the screws that will allow the motor casing to come apart and reveal the armature and the commutator and the brushes. There are 2 small screws in the bottom here that require a flat-headed screwdriver, and the 2 screws here that hold the brushes in place. Quite why Mainline decided to add this red liquid plastic stuff to insulate the screws on this model, I'm not sure, as everything's made of plastic and there's nothing that can cause a short circuit. The brushes are stuck solid in there and wouldn't come out. I'm going to have to use some bigger screwdrivers, so I resort to using this set that I reviewed in one of my Aldi and Lidl videos. Using some force, it appears that the plastic has either swelled over time and the screws were an extremely tight fit. This may be the reason why the motor's not turning, if the plastic has swollen and is pinning the motor armature against the casing. But it does require some persuasion to come out. The pliers there just to prise it apart, and the gears fall out the bottom, and then eventually the motor comes apart and I can access the armature and the commutator plate. As you can see there's the armature. I'm just going to pull it out gently, and the commutator is filthy with marks on it, and the brushes are stuck solid in their holders. There is a lot of black gunk and carbon deposits in this model. Heaven knows when this, or if this has ever been serviced since it left the Mainline factory in the late 1970s or early 1980s. The lubrication has gone thick, and like I said, the commutator plate there had markings on it where the brushes have been stuck to it for many years. So I'm hoping this can be cleaned up okay. So going with my tried and trusted method of methylated spirits and a cotton bud, I start by removing all the old congealed grease and oil from the axle spindles there, which is a orangey yellow colour, and then I give the inside of the motor housing a wipe, and to my astonishment it is absolutely filthy with carbon deposits. No wonder this wasn't running very well. So now I give the motor housing front and back part a very thorough cleaning with cotton buds and methylated spirits. All the dirt needs to be removed from this, and as I said, I am unsure as to whether this has ever been serviced in the past. I can't see any issues with these casings themselves, so I'm hoping that once this has had a thorough clean and we put the motor back together, it will start up again. Now what I'm going to do now, you can just see all the amount of muck I've got off there. Now the commutator face plate there, I give this a good scrub with methylated spirits on a cotton bud to remove all that congealed grease and carbon deposits, and also remove the marks where the brushes have been pressed against it for nearly 2 decades without moving. The gaps in the brass plate there were cleaned with a cocktail stick, and then the whole thing was polished up slowly and gently with my fiberglass pencil, just to remove the burrs and the build-up that's stuck on there. After it's been gently polished up to shining brass, it was again given a once more wipe over with a cotton bud and methylated spirits to ensure that it was absolutely crystal clean. And that's looking a world away from what it was when we pulled it out of the motor housing. Once this has all been cleaned up and I've inspected the coils and the coils seem okay, I'm going to give the motor housing parts a quick blast over with the WD-40 contact cleaner, especially down the brush holding tubes there, and then I'm going to set them on this paper towel to dry, and again give them another going over with the cotton bud just to ensure that all that muck that was on there has been removed. Whilst I've been doing that, the brushes and springs have been soaking in a concentrate of the contact cleaner for a few hours. So now I'm going to fish them out of this pot with my tweezer nose pliers and give them a clean up. This was just so that the cleaner penetrated the brushes and got rid of all the oil and grease on them. The springs themselves weren't in too bad a condition at all, but the brushes were exceptionally dirty. Now they may look small, but they are small in mainline models, and there's plenty of years worth of use out of these springs and brushes just yet. Replacement brushes from Hornby were too big for the motor, so I'm going to stick with these and see how we get on. Now everything's been cleaned up, I'm going to start by reassembling it by putting the armature in there and make sure the commutator is facing where the brushes go, and then I'm going to just give all the gears a quick clean over because I overlooked this when I did the cleaning, and there's some congealed grease and grime on these as well. So I'll give these a clean over again with the cotton bud and methylated spirits to ensure that all the gears have had the old lubrication removed, and then I put some silicone grease on the gear spindles ready for reassembling the gear train. Now the gear train will only go back one way, and there's a lot of cogs in this. It does seem to be a bit over-engineered, a bit complicated really when you think how simple it could have been. But the smaller gears go on, and then one larger gear which engages with the gear on the back of the armature. The gear on the back of the armature is of brass manufacture, so it's surprising that it's not worn away the plastic gears over time. Once they're all back in place, the rear of the motor housings put on there, making sure that all the plastic lugs line up with their slots, and then I'm going to just put a small amount of lubricating oil on the gears as well as the silicone, and also on the motor bearing front and back, as there are 2 bearings on either side of the motor casing. Don't overdo the oil, just a tiny drop will do, especially on the bearings, as you don't want to get any on the commutator that you've just spent all that time cleaning. And now I'm going to refit the screws after scraping that red insulating stuff off them that Mainline used. But do not over tighten them, as this plastic is old, and as we saw before, it was stuck fast before, so don't over tighten them, otherwise you could end up breaking the casing and having to buy a new motor. Once it's been screwed back together, the brushes are put back in with the springs, and the brush retainers are replaced with the screws and the wire connector that goes on each screw and makes contact with the brush connector. Once that's all done, we're going to try and give it a quick battery test, I think. Well, I'm going to put these bottom gears in first, and these gears just simply push in and they're on like a metal axle, and again they'll only go in one way so that they engage with the drive cog and then pass power to the drive wheels. They simply clip in to the motor frame there, and they fit in, and they're quite a snug fit. So once they're both back in, I also give them a bit of a light lubrication as well. And you can see here that even after all that cleaning, there's still some hair round one of these gears. Look, God knows how long that's been on there or who that belonged to. Now we're going to look at the driving wheels themselves. The traction tyres are actually too big for this model. These are standard Hornby ones, and I actually found that replacing these with Hornby Class 50 traction tyres from the early 2000s model, well, they was an exact fit, so I replaced them with Class 50 traction tyres, which is a handy tip and worth remembering if you can't get traction tyres for mainline models. I'm going to give the driving wheels a thorough clean now, initially with my cotton bud and method, and then I polish them up with a fiberglass brush and make sure that all the crud and dirt's gone, including that's in the groove where the traction tyre goes. So now I've completely revamped this motor, and I'm anticipating an easy battery test, and I think it's going to fire up first time. However, there's no power being transferred to the brushes at all. This was extremely disheartening, and I was beginning to wonder whether or not I'd be able to fix this model after all. Even with the leads from the power controller, the motor was showing no signs of life. I'd stripped it completely down, I'd cleaned everything, it should have worked. The magnet was strong, and I'm not entirely sure what's going wrong here. Even by putting the power to the brush terminals, something was stopping the motor from turning. So I had a dig around, I did some investigations, and the only thing I could think of was when we disassembled it, I mentioned that red stuff that Mainline used to insulate their screws. So I took the brass screws out and the brush keeper plates, and I scraped it all off. There is no reason for this to be on this model. On split chassis metal framed models it's essential, but on this plastic one it's not. So having scraped it all off and then reassembled the model again, I put it in my helping hands device, just so I had one hand free to hold the wires there, although I did still just drop them. And I put the motor on, and hey presto, I put the wires on and the motor fired up lovely. So at long last I found the problem. So now I'm going to give the bogie frames a quick clean up to remove all the grease and grime that's in there. And then I'm going to replace the motor back into the bogie frame. It's a simple case of putting it the right way around, and it's just a push clip fit into the plastic frame. But work gently, as you don't want to snap the frame, as it's easily done. Now, holding it upside down with the motor terminals on the battery so that the wheels are spinning, I'm going to give the wheels a quick final polish up, as I noticed I'd missed a bit when we cleaned them with the cotton bud. And then again another polish up with the cotton bud there. So now that's done, I am now going to clean the pony wheels that came off. We took these off earlier. The front pony wheels in particular had a lot of build-up of black deposits on them, so this was all cleaned off. And one thing to remember when reassembling is these wheels are 2 different sizes. The larger wheel fits on the rear of the bogie, and is the same size as the driving wheels, and the smaller wheel goes at the front, and it's the leading pony wheel. These were replaced onto the bogie with their small self-tapping screws. Again, do not over tighten these screws especially, as I'm going to demonstrate here. If you tighten them up fully, the pony truck will not swivel, so they need releasing a quarter of a turn, and now they're free to turn round corners as it was designed to. Now I'm going to look at the non-driving bogie and where the pickups are, and again, using these pliers, I just lever the bogie frame off and it just unclips from the wheel sets, and we can work on them separately. Once the wheels have been removed, I'm going to clean the pickups using the fiberglass pencil just to remove the buildup of dirt on the pickups there. And I also find that when cleaning this, one of the wires to the pickups is actually broken. The solder joint has come off because the solder's dried out over time. So I'm going to reattach that with my soldering iron. And then I'm going to clean the wheel backs and the wheels of the non-driving bogie. Now that you can see there that the bogie actually comes apart into two pieces once the wheels are removed. As there's no screws holding this together, this is simply held together by the bogie frame and the wheels being in place. As these are pickup wheels, I need to polish the wheel backs on these, so I do that with my fiberglass pencil, again followed up by a cotton bud and methylated spirits, just to make sure that the wheel backs are all nice and shiny for conducting electricity from the track to the motor. Once the wheels have been cleaned, I simply clip them back into the dummy bogie there, and they clip fit and ensure that the pickups are rubbing on both wheel backs to ensure good running. Once that's done, add a small amount of lubrication, as there's no proper bearings in this model and I don't particularly want to run it bone dry on plastic and metal. So once that's done, again, this bogie frame was cleaned up and the rear of the buffer beam was painted black. This was reassembled in the same way as the driving bogie with the pony wheels, and again the coupling was replaced with a more modern standard NEN type, as we did with the front bogie there. Once it's all been reassembled, after the coupling screwed into place there, we can clip this back onto the wheel, or don't know what you'd call it, a dummy bogie wheel holder, I suppose. But that was pushed down gently again like we did with the front one, and that was clipped into place and ensure that the wheels all turn freely. So now what we're going to do is we're going to reattach I'm going to try and tighten this front weight up, as it does keep spinning. The screw must have worked loose, and then the driving bogie was put back in place, and this retaining clip was placed onto the motor case, and again with the aid of some needle nose pliers, the screw was reinserted, which secures the motor driving bogie back in place. So now that rebuild's almost done, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to fit a digital decoder to this model. I'm just going to give that a quick battery test just to make sure everything's still running nicely, which it is. And an AE model's decoder is going to be soldered in the usual method. A red and black wire to track. So I'm just attaching the black wire here, and you can see the heat shrink up the green wire there, which I'm going to put over the join. And the red wire went to the black wire. I should have put the black to black, but I didn't think at the time. And then once that's all done and the heat shrink has been shrunk with the heat from the soldering iron, the orange and grey wires were soldered directly to the motor terminals. And then once that's done, the decoder itself is slotted into its harness and the whole thing is given a test. You had to work gently soldering these wires onto the motor terminals, as this was directly onto plastic. I didn't want to melt it. And this terminal here especially had a lot of old wire stuck in the solder that was already on there, so I had to remove that and then attach the orange wire. But as I said, go carefully, as you don't want to melt the motor housing. And then the decoder was simply gently push fit into its harness when it was the right way round. And then the whole thing was tested to make sure that we'd soldered it up right and there were no short circuits. So a battery test proves now that, again, nothing. built you up there to think it was going to run, and nothing, it was dead. But on investigation, the green wire had come unsoldered in the dummy bogie. So I stripped it all down again and reattached that wire, and now we test it, and the chassis is a runner at long last, and it's digitally fitted, which is a bonus. So at long last, we're now getting somewhere. I'm going to turn my attention now to the body shell, which I've given a quick dusting over, although there wasn't really much to dust off this, but I'm going to touch in the detail painting and add a bit of paint on it. First up, I'm going to do is, using this tiny brush, I'm just going to paint the red lenses in the tail lights, as they have been left as yellow plastic, and it's something of a bugbear of mine. Even though they weren't illuminated, red tail lights lenses were visible when trains went past. So just using this tiny paintbrush, a small amount of red paint is added to the tail light lenses there. And then once that's done and dry and cleaned my brush, I'm using this Tamiya white paint to touch in the handrails, which have all been chipped through years of use and play. And I also touch in the white around the nameplates, which had also worn off. And the whole thing was left to dry overnight before we tackle the next item. This paintbrush really is tiny, and it made light work of this detail painting. Now, sometime in the past this model's been broken, and these body securing clips have been fashioned out of plasticard, but they stick too far below the body shell. So using a file, I'm just going to file them down there to the correct size, and then touch them in with some Rail Match BR blue paint. You can see the light blue undercoat colour there of this Mainline peak. Once that's all done and dry, I'm going to refit the polystyrene thing there, which has got a face drawn on it. I don't know who did that, sometime in the past. But I'm going to refix that in the body shell, and then using some Tamiya masking tape just secure the DCC chip to it. Being on polystyrene will ensure that there is no metal to metal contact, so that will eliminate any problems of short circuits. I then put the body shell back on with the aid of a small flat bladed screwdriver just to pull the body securing clips in there. And then one final job with the paintbrush was just to paint blue the brown clips from the chassis that sit through underneath the cab doors. These were painted blue to make them not so obvious, and it really did add a finishing touch to the model. Now, I was thinking we were getting somewhere with this model, however on a test run it ran really poorly because of the lack of pickups. So I went through the spares box and found this old pickup from a Bachmann model, and I actually screwed it onto the bogie which has the motor onto it. Drilling a 1mm hole, I screw it on there so that the motor bogie also has a pickup now. So it's picking up from 4 wheels on one side of the model and only 2 on the other. So what I did, I thought long and hard about it, as there was very little place to put an extra pickup. I'm just going to thread the wire through the chassis there, and this was then soldered onto the corresponding pickup wire, and the heat shrink was replaced. But like I said, I couldn't find anywhere else to add a pickup onto the traction tyre side of the model. So what I ended up doing, as you'll see shortly when I finish faffing about with this heat shrink here, is I solder a piece of brass wire onto the pickup on the rear bogie and make it spring so it pushes on the pony truck that is at the rear of the dummy bogie. So now it's 4-wheel pickup on one side, 3-wheel pickup on the other. The spring has, the brass wire has to have a slight spring in it to keep in contact with the wheel whilst it's going around adverse corners as that wheel there pivots. So now it's all done and dusted, and I gave it a test run. It seemed to work quite well. And I'm just going to give it a battery test to make sure that there is no short circuits with the wiring, and the chassis runs quite nicely. So it was tidied all the wiring up again and popped the body shell back on. So let's remind ourselves what we started with at the start of this rebuild. My dad's old Peak had seized solid. It was quite dusty and the paint had chipped on the detail areas. There was no life in the motor at all when we tried to run this, and it was disheartening, as a kid I remember this running around on our layout, pulling various freight trains and coaches. So having worked on it, this is what she looks like now. She's got modern NEM style couplings. She's been rebuilt from the ground up, is no longer seized solid and is digitally fitted. In the future I'm going to weather this peak up a little bit as it looks a bit too pristine. But I'm pleased with the results, and I'm pleased that I've managed to reactivate a childhood favourite of mine and one of my dad's models back to operational order. And I'm going to leave you now with some views of her bombing around my layout before I return her to my dad. If you've got an engine you'd like to see featured on Trash to Track, please email me at dansmodelrailways@gmail.com and we'll have a look at getting it sent over, and it may feature in a future episode of Trash to Track. I hope you'll all agree that we've managed to return this peak from a derelict condition back into peak perfection, and it is giving peak performance on my layout. Thanks again for watching Trash to Track. Please like, share and subscribe, and I'll catch you in the next one. Bye for now.